Addiction is a part of us, but it's not who we are.
Get your daily dose of motivation on the Motivational Moments with Michelle podcast. In Motivation with Michelle podcast, you'll get encouraging, uplifting, and life-changing wisdom that will transform your world at your fingertips, 24 hours a day. Get a fuller, deeper revelation of the tools you can implement to see incredible transformation in your life from Michelle Neustadter's powerful teachings. Tune in whenever you need to be edified, uplifted, or a dose of motivation, no matter where you are. Subscribe to Motivational Moments with Michelle podcast with Michelle Neustadter today on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or SoundCloud.
This idea of uprooting and doing that addictions work. The peer support it's good. It is helpful,
Absolutely.
Right? We need to know that other people have been there. We need to know that we're not alone. We need to have people who are walking beside us. That is such an integral part of the healing process. But that in and of itself is not enough, because you have to have that mental health side of things. You have to have the uprooting side of the process. And that is why we are really heavily pushing forward this idea of regulation of counseling and psychotherapy in Alberta, is because so much of the support that people receive currently is either peer support, which we said is good, but not enough, or not qualified support to do the uprooting work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Because it's so necessary to step into that space and be able to dig deep, but also teach self-regulation and how do I deal with those emotions that come up as I dig deep.
Yeah.
And as I learn things like boundaries, and as I learn how to shift how I interact with my world and all of these pieces, right? We need to have really good, solid, qualified support to walk us through that piece.
Totally.
Otherwise, it can sometimes do more damage than good. If we don't do that heavy lifting, if we don't do the hard work, so many of us wind up right back where we started, because we don't know how to deal with those big emotional responses, that we don't know how to self-regulate when something triggers us, or we're really stressed, and especially if there's a mental health issue. One of the things that I see as a problem with some of those rehabilitation programs is that they start you off and they keep you in this lovely little bubble for this short window of time.
Yeah.
And then they release you back to the world without any additional support.
That's right.
Which is why so many people find themselves relapsing and going right back into that addiction space.
Right. And a lot of the services that we are partnering with, or that people access in the public system, there seems to be almost like I don't know if you've seen this, but I've seen people from the mental health side refuse to deal with someone's mental health because they're high or they're drunk. It's like, you need to be sober before we'll deal with your mental health. And then on the flip side, we've got addiction treatment centers that don't know how to deal with schizophrenia or bipolar or any of the other major mental illnesses. They're like, we're just going to deal with your addiction, and you need other supports for your mental health. And I remember when I first began my career in Manitoba with the Navy, there was an initiative put out by Brandon, Manitoba. They were the ones that were basically the pioneers of creating the registered psychiatric nurse. I'm not one of those, but I was an RN who specialized in mental health. But then there's this whole RPN thing, and they came from Brandon, and they popularized this model known as the CODI initiative, the co-occurring disorders initiative, where they basically said there cannot be a wrong door when it comes to addiction and mental health. Like, it doesn't matter what comes through your door. You're dealing with the addiction and you're dealing with the mental health, whether they're high, whether they're psychotic. So we gotta get them away from that siloed mentality. And as professionals, we have to be able to walk through that storm with them and go, okay, what's driving what? Is it the addiction that's driving the psychosis? Very common. We can have dysregulation because of whatever substance they're on. They're hallucinating, but is it primary schizophrenia? Probably not. It's secondary due to substance use. And then trying to work through that. Sometimes it's just coping because they do have primary schizophrenia and they want to shut the voices off. So they drink themselves into a stupor because it's the only time that they finally feel solace. So we need to know, what are we dealing with and how can we walk alongside these people and create that awareness in this space of addiction work.
Exactly. And, I think it's helpful to note that there are places out there that are trying to make a difference in terms of that and not having that siloed effect, right? You partner with the Thumbs Up Foundation.
Yeah.
And it's intentional to start to remove some of the siloed effect, right?
Sure.
And this is one of those things that needs to come to a really solid end. I mean, I don't know that it can completely come to an end because there's always going to be people who, only want to deal with one thing or don't trust the rest of the system or are focused on like me and what I can do for you.
Yeah.
Versus how do we get you what you need?
That's right.
And that's where the focus needs to be is, can I get you what you need? Because of how important this is. Mental health, addiction, and overdose, they all go hand in hand. And if we're not dealing with all of the, like you said, right, the comorbid, all of the pieces that work together that are creating the issue, the individual issue for each individual person needs to be able to be addressed simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. As you're talking, I'm just starting to think of another piece to this that I'd love people to think about as we're talking about awareness. We've been talking about what addiction is. I also think it might be relevant to discuss what it isn't. And maybe for those listening, overdose isn't just attention-seeking behavior. Sometimes those of us who don't struggle will assume, oh, they're just looking for attention. I don't see that very typically. It's also not a character flaw. And I really, really want people to hear this because addiction isn't a behavior problem. It is not like when we think of diagnostics, I'm not allowed to diagnose as a nurse, but one of the things I was trained in early on was understanding the axis system of diagnosis. And one of those parts, like I think it's axis 3, is talking about physical problems. Sometimes we would think of addiction as a physical problem, like you're an addict. That's very popular language when we talk about 12-step. But what if it wasn't our identity? What if it wasn't a behavior problem? What if it was predominantly an axis 1 disorder that affects the mind? There's a problem with self-control. There's a problem with self-regulation. You're not bad, you're sick. Let that sink in for a minute. Like, what if people weren't bad? People that struggle with addiction aren't bad, broken people. They have an illness that we don't fully understand. If I was dealing with someone with diabetes, would it make any sense whatsoever for me to shame and blame the diabetic for not being able to control their blood sugar? Of course not. And yet, how often do we as a society do that with those struggling with addiction? You're the problem. No, you're not. You have a disease that you don't understand, and it takes away your ability to choose until we rewire some of those pathways so that you can choose again. So you're not bad, you're sick. And maybe that's something that'll give people comfort. I can't believe saying you're sick would give comfort, but it's way different than identifying as the problem. And that's really what I want people to hear this morning is you're not bad. There's a disease that you don't understand. And this is where we can arm ourselves with knowledge. We can increase awareness. We can figure out how to find that why power, not just white-knuckled willpower to abstain for another week.
You had mentioned how, saying I'm an addict isn't necessarily the right languaging, right? Because it's not a character flaw. It's not who you are. I mean,
Right.
Almost the entirety of our world is predisposed to addiction. There may be a few outliers that don't have that gene, but at this point in time in our world, I would say most people are born with the gene for addiction.
Yeah.
So to just label ourselves an addict or that, this runs in my family or that kind of thing, takes away your power for one thing, because you're defined by it.
Yeah.
The other piece that I was thinking about was in this disease model of addiction, as long as we look at it as a disease that we can heal from, something like, say, type 1 diabetes, you're kind of stuck with that.
Right.
You are a diabetic for the rest of your life. Whereas with addiction, it's more like cancer. There's certain forms of cancer, right? You go through the protocol, the treatment, you get the cancer cells removed, you go through your chemo, you go through your radiation, and some people can go into remission from their cancer and they can kind of come to a place where that it no longer lives in their body. So cancer is a disease, and it's an awful disease, and it kills hundreds of thousands of people. So does addiction.
I do like the analogy you're using with cancer. That does seem more apt, because I would look at someone in recovery as the disease in remission, because it's still there. It doesn't take much for someone who struggles with addiction to go back down that path. So in terms of identification, I would agree. It's not that I am an addict. When I ask people to describe what they're going through and they say, well, I'm an addict, what I try to do is I try to push that around and flip it around so they really start to understand, well, who are you really? You're not just a sum total of all of your problems. That's not your identity. That might be your history. That might be where you came from. But the real questions are, who do you want to become? What happens when someone who struggles with the disease of addiction starts to wrestle with those questions? Well, I'm an addict. No, you're not. And I'm going to use myself as an example. If I walk in and I say I'm an addict, I'm misrepresenting myself. My name is Troy. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a professional in the mental health space, and I happen to struggle with the disease of addiction. It's not my identity. It's just one more piece. Addiction is a part of us, but it's not who we are. And sometimes I'll even personify the addiction, and I'll talk about it as another entity unto itself. So it's like some people go and name their addiction. Well, my addiction's name is Ed, whatever. Sorry if your name is Ed. But so there's Troy fighting for control with Ed. Ed is all about himself, like the id that Freud used to talk about. So I like Ed because it reminds me of the id, just that primal desire for more. And Ed has beat me up for years. He's worked out in the gym 7 days a week. He's buff. I've fed this guy whatever he wants because he yells at me and intimidates me. And then I finally understand that Ed isn't Troy. He's a part of me, but he's not who I am. And once we can separate those two, we can then start to deprive Ed of his needed resources so that he starts to shrivel up. And instead, we're going to put all those resources back into Troy so that he can start to develop the right mindset to learn how to say no. But before you can say no to the addiction, N-O, we may need to know, K-N-O-W, what we're dealing with and how we need to fight this battle. And that's where this awareness piece is so important, because what is addiction? What is it not? And what does that make us that struggle with it? How can we find hope in the middle of something that's so painful, that has taken brothers from us and sons and friends and family? How can we have a very sober mind as we think about this? We remember those who have come before, but we don't just accept where we're at. We design something different. We figure out that there is a way to do this work. We find our courage and we start making different choices. That could be your today. Today could be the first day of the rest of your life. Sounds kind of cheesy, but prove to me why that wouldn't be true. You could replay all the patterns of yesterday, or today matters, and we could make today count.